Awesome, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the decline log, what it is, so the questions that we ask the data collectors to respond to, and some ways that you might be able to use the data that you have collected from those questions. Very broadly, we use the decline log to have an approximate understanding of who says no to data collectors, check for some response biases, or maybe contextualize the data we're reporting. And we can also use it to identify maybe some data collection challenges, or if your data collectors are using it consistently, which we strongly encourage, you can use that for response rates instead of the tracking log. So as a reminder, if you haven't done this piece of it in a while, data collectors are prompted to fill out that form when a visitor says no or they stop part way through the survey. Almost all the questions are the same except for the why they said no or why they stopped. So today we're just going to focus on the decline log data, especially because at MOS we have very few people, very few partials, and most of the data in our log is no's. So the simplest way to look at the data is what we're going to do today. So to start, as a reminder, what are we asking on this decline log? The first couple of questions are trying to look at about how big the group is. So what was the apparent size of the group? And did they reference somebody else in their group that was not standing there with them? So we might have an idea of, oh, we talked to one person, but they're actually part of a bigger group because they said they're going to go catch up with their group. We have those roughly categorized. We're really looking at, is it a small group? Is it a medium group? Is it a big group? And for this and for all the questions, there is that unable to collect this information. Maybe it's unclear. Maybe the museum's really busy and trying to figure out who is in a clump together in a huge sea of people is really challenging. Or there might be other reasons for this or other questions that the data collector might not be able to answer this clearly or feel confident answering it. Usually it's pretty straightforward. We ask whether or not there were any children in the group, which lets us ask, look at the types of groups. Are they adult-only groups? Are they family and multi-generational groups? We ask about perceived gender. What was the apparent gender of the person who refused or did not complete the survey? We do know that this is imperfect, but this was largely in response to research that shows that women are generally more socialized to say yes to things and say yes to the survey. And so that was something that we wanted to check and in understanding our data. For the group composition or group type, we have the very straightforward yes or no, but also just a single visitor that didn't reference anyone. Maybe there were more people, maybe there weren't. Or some people have adult-only events or adult-only hours they might collect data during. And so then by default, we would know that those groups don't have children in them. And then the last piece of the decline log is asking the data collectors to roughly categorize why visitors are saying no to us with some of those common concerns already supplied. If you check the other, there's a spot to fill in, and you could look at those open-ended responses to see if there are other patterns emerging that either are just good context for your data collectors or might be something you might want to follow up on. So for example, at the Museum of Science, we have a lot of people that are very concerned about Boston traffic. We can't control for that, but it is a good thing to know and good for our data collectors to know that that's something that they might encounter. Or we get questions about parking tickets or concerned about their parking running out. So from that, all those questions, in the links that we share when you start COVES, we have a link to the raw decline log data. We use Google Forms because there are some limitations on our Qualtrics account that we can't pour all the no's into there. But that also means your data comes out as a Google Sheet. And if you don't already have this link, you can either check your links sheet in your Dropbox folder or email Kate and Aditi with Art Bridges if you're an Art Bridges site, and they can get that link for you. The way it comes out is just a big old spreadsheet with the labeled responses of what people say. And we know that this is a lot of data. You can go through it and do whatever analyses you want on that. We have also started to put together a response summary. This actually came from a request from one of my MOS colleagues who wanted to know if we had it summarized. And I said, no, but I can make that happen. So this should exist on everyone's decline log data. If I have somehow missed you, please let me know, and it's easy to copy it over. But this is a monthly summary of all the data showing the counts and percentages for each question and response. So you can do analysis with that raw data. You can just look at the summaries, whatever is going to answer the questions you have. So I'm going to walk through some of the questions that we have had with the data at MOS, how I pulled the data, what we saw, and all of this is looking at our previous fiscal year. Any questions so far before I jump into that piece? Great. So to start, we wanted to look at our visitor group types and check against some perceptions that we have that maybe family groups are probably going to be more likely to say no because they're worried about the kids or might have some child concerns. So from this comparison, I pulled data from the decline log for fiscal year 23. So that's July 2022 through June 2023. And in that response summary sheet, I've color-coded that July to June fiscal year because that is effectively the COVES fiscal year as well. And pulled from the question, did this group contain any children or adolescents, and grouping no's with single visitor who did not reference anyone else. Museum of Science doesn't have any adult-only times that we collect during, so that was just 0 across the board. And I just excluded the unable to collect that information. It was a pretty small percentage of our overall, so I wasn't too worried about trying to figure out where that fit in. And then next, I pulled the data from the Qualtrics dashboard, filtering for fiscal year 23 to have that same time period, and used the widget that shows the number of children in the group. And then I split this into adults only and everyone else, groups with children. The art sites, the default widget pulls these data in a little bit differently as one adult, 2 or more adults, and adults and children, whereas the science default is number of children in group with adults only, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more children. So slightly different ways to get to it, but effectively the same data, and it's all pulling from the same raw data. And so again, for today's purposes, I did not do any statistical comparisons. We are just looking at descriptive data. You could do this with your raw data and pull from the raw data to do statistical comparisons, but I wouldn't recommend it with just the gross widgets. And so in this card, we had, from the decline log, we had 1,289 responses, so groups that said no, versus the COVES data where we had 1,223 responses of groups that said yes. Throughout this, decline log data is blue on top with the COVES data out of the dashboard and green on the bottom. So from this, we can see that family groups are more likely to say yes in taking survey than adult-only groups, which is slightly different than our perception that groups with children are more concerned about their children and might say no to us. Can dig into what this means. Maybe we could do a statistical analysis in the future to see if this is something we're concerned about. But we see there isn't a huge gap between them. Next, looking at group size, we have a few ways to pull these data in. So for today's comparison, I'm just looking at the apparent size of the group. I looked at whether or not visitors referenced other group members and saw that 9% of these visitors did, but most of them wouldn't bump it up clearly up to the group size. So someone in 3 to 6 said there was another group member. It's not clear from our data if that 3 to 6 bumps them into 7 or was 3 people and bumping into 4. So I've excluded it for today, but that would be something that you might want to look at, you know, your medium versus your bigger groups, and think about how you are comparing those data. So from the data in the COVES dashboard, I used the filters on the adults widget, since all groups need to have at least one adult, and added together the possible combinations of children in the group to get the group size. Again, for the art size, your default widgets are a little bit different for group size, so probably will require digging into your raw data for a more easy comparison. However, if this is a comparison that you want to make more regularly or continually make, just let us know and we can pull the default widget from the science sites and build that on your dashboard. And so since the categories on the widget and the survey data are slightly different, I did end up collapsing the categories into 1 person, 2 people, or a group of 3 or more. But in the decline log, I could see that fewer than 3% of groups were larger than 7 people. So I wasn't as concerned about comparing those really, really big groups. However, if that question is of interest to you, how many really, really big groups do we have? The raw survey data can be used for a much more nuanced look to more directly compare to that decline survey. So from this comparison, I can see at the Museum of Science, the group size for people who say yes and people who say no are pretty close. So we aren't dramatically oversampling those single visitors or very small groups, or oversampling the very large groups. And I think there's some rounding errors in here just for the size of the data set. So our group size is pretty reflective whether they say yes or no to us, or would be pretty reflective of our overall audience. And then the last big comparison that I did was looking at gender. And so there is existing research that points to women being socialized to saying yes to surveys. So another one of our questions was whether this bias would impact our data as well. And so this is directly pulled from each data source. You'll see in the next slide that I simplified it a bit. But on the decline log, what is the perceived gender? On the dashboard, what is the respondent's gender? Because the person saying no is effectively the person who would have said yes, or someone would have said yes and they would have taken the survey. So since other research usually looks at binary gender identities, and we know that perceived gender can be complicated. For example, it wouldn't necessarily be clear that if the data collector wasn't sure if that is someone who would prefer to self-describe. I have just included the binary gender split for this comparison, but you could dig into your own data in a more nuanced way if that made sense to the questions you were asking. So from this, we do see that women are slightly more likely to say yes to us and complete the survey for us. Again, we could go into the raw data and do a statistical comparison and decide if this would impact how we report the data, but we know that it does align with some of those established biases. And the last piece I wanted to share was around Why do people say no? We don't have a why do people say yes question to compare to, which would also have wildly different reasons, I would imagine. But we do have an idea of why are people saying no. And this just pulls in from that decline log and summarizes the common responses. However, giant asterisk, for that other write in, it doesn't neatly spit out into the Google Sheet. So you would have to, I can't set up a formula that reads all possible others. Therefore, you would have to go through and filter and do some qualitative analysis of those and read through them. A lot of them end up being, at our site, end up being duplicates of these with more detail. So someone might select visitor had a group or child concerns, and they would add a note of other want to get to lunch, or child having a meltdown, or visitor did not speak English. This is the language they spoke. So if you were interested in why people are saying no, you could do go through and look at that in a qualitative way. And we see at the Museum of Science, most people just say no. They just politely decline. Half of our visitors are just nope, no thank you, I don't want to. We have a small percentage who do not speak English and have indicated that to the data collector. We have a small 5% that just ignore the data collector as they walk by, 12% with child concerns, 21% with schedule conflict. And that's where our data collectors tend to write the most notes of what that conflict was, whether it's parking, it's hitting traffic in Boston, if it's going on a duck tour that also departs from our building. So that is a very quick look at what the decline log is, what we can ask of it, and the types of comparisons you can make. I would love to open this up to questions or discussions or thoughts about how you might use those data.
I will just jump in and say a few things. One, it was really helpful in your presentation, Allison, of including the sample sizes, not just by way of like showing the power of the data, but again, we had over 1,000 in both of those groups. So to your point about not conducting statistical difference tests, one or two percentages may hint at a small bias, which could be statistically significantly different. But again, the question comes back to like, what are we really trying to say? So when I watched your presentation, I thought to myself, these aren't wildly different. Like I'm not actually worried about our responding sample, but it kind of confirms everything you were saying about what the research suggests, right? There's a slight bias towards women saying yes or filling out the survey, and therefore men saying no. There's a slight bias towards groups with children saying no a little bit more frequently, but not so much that our COVES data are not defensible. And again, the power of the sample size is important because I think that's really only useful knowing that we're doing the decline log consistently, right? That all of our data collectors are doing it. We don't have huge gaps in the months. So I just want to make that comment too, because I think haphazard or sporadic use of the decline log would lead to an analysis like this that's a little more fraught with question, right? Like how do I need to minimize the window that I'm comparing the data to?
And that's something that whenever we have a big new batch of data collectors, I do the very tedious task of looking at the tracking log, which we require our data collectors to use at the Museum of Science, because we have a lot of people that contribute. I will go through and do rough checks month by month as we have new data collectors of, are all of the no's that they're reporting as no showing up in our decline log? And because I do that periodically, I have a lot of confidence that there's a little wiggle room, but more in the margin of error of when you fill in the tracking log, did 3 or 4 people say no to me? that it's like a few people a month, maybe. There aren't dramatic differences. So I have a lot of confidence that our data collectors are using the decline log regularly. They use the tracking log because we require them to. And so I have that confidence that the decline log is being used consistently. Any other questions? Thoughts how you might use this? Thoughts whether this is useful?
I have a question. Do you have any examples of like, okay, so I got my data and how has it been useful for your museum? Like which choices have, or do you have any examples of, oh, because I know this, because we analyzed this data, we did this.
Do you mean for the decline, this data that Allison was talking about specifically, or for
Yeah,
COVES
yeah,
data
for
in
the,
general?
no, yeah, for specifically about the data that Allison was talking about.
I would let Ryan or Alex jump in, but I think for us, it is generally that helps us stand behind the COVES data and say really confidently, this represents our museum visitors.
Yeah, I have two concrete examples, Isabel. The first is our chief operating officer a number of years ago was adamant that our museum was for kids, like adults and kids, right? But groups bringing children under 18, and we were able to use COVES data to point out that more than a third of our groups were adult only groups, and he kind of came back with, well, groups of kids are less likely to respond to the survey because they're so busy. And this individual sat in an office where he was adjacent to the exhibit halls where basically field trip groups were in all the time. So all this person saw were kids. In the combination of our COVES sample data and the decline log data, we were able to demonstrate that there might be a small bias towards adult only groups in our sample, but overall, when you just look at the random sample, we do have 30 to 35% adult only groups in our museum at any given time. And the second concrete example I have is with a partner site, a children's museum that was kind of slow to start with data collection. I shouldn't say children's museum. It was a child-focused museum, a science center that was child-focused. And they were really reluctant during the training and the month after the training to intercept groups at exit because they felt like groups with kids they can't respond, right? They're holding their babies, they're trying to get out for lunch, their snacks. And so again, we used this analysis of the COVES sample they were able to collect and the decline log data they were able to collect to demonstrate the exact same thing, that there was really minute differences, if at all, in the group composition factor between the groups that were saying yes and no to our sampling procedure. And that kind of gave them a little bit of confidence that even if it felt like an imposition to the data collectors, the groups who were responding didn't differentially respond. So again, to Allison's point, it gives us confidence in our data collection method, in that training protocol that all of you have gone through now, knowing that we're doing the best we can to generate a random sample.
Thank you for the examples.
Beth had a question, giving that slight bias in a survey response rate, would it be more accurate to use the group level gender to describe our visitors versus the respondent data? Maybe. I would probably do the check and see, does your data fall the same? How big of a difference? I know you have a really big data set, so I'd be maybe inclined to do the statistical comparison on the raw data. But I think that's up to you, and being able to do that comparison yourself might sway you one way or the other. For Lauren's question, this was an aggregate. I just pulled the MOS data. I don't know what the aggregate is. I haven't looked at it, but it would definitely be worth pulling that for your own data and see if that is a higher refusal rating. And sadly, there is not currently a way to get this in the dashboard. We might be able to figure that out. I'm going to promise nothing because
Yeah, it's so for both of these, just thinking about aggregating across institutions, it's complicated. One, we don't have a primary research agenda for combining the decline log analysis other than to support the sample of COVES data that we're able to collect at all of our institutions. And two, as Allison just showed you, because it's in Google Forms, the data come out in Google Sheets, and that means there's more than 80 different data files. So it really is a comparison to your own sample rather than thinking about the aggregate, although I suppose that would be a nice addition to some of our aggregate reporting techniques. But Lauren, thinking again of your question, or just the data that Allison was able to share, 55% of our declining sample gave no reason for declining. But that doesn't mean it's because they don't speak English or feel confident in their English abilities or have one of those other concerns. It just wasn't communicated to the data collector. So you're not wrong. I bet there's a high proportion, even within the sample of data that we looked at, that actually have language concerns around the survey, not just the 3% that was shown. And yes, I would double check yours to kind of verify if there are other languages that need to be included in future translations and things like that.
And that's something that our data collectors will note with the visitor did not speak English. If they communicate that language, there were a bunch of notes that I saw that did not speak English, comfortable in Mandarin. So we have that qualitatively in there that we could pull out if we needed to.
I'm pretty interested in thinking about whether there's an relatively painless way to incorporate this, refusal rate and demographic comparison, all this decline log data on the dashboard. I don't immediately know of a way that's easy enough, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. So no immediate promises, but it's certainly on the list for fun problems to try to think about to make this more useful.
I have a quick question. So most of this was like just validating by showing there's not a huge discrepancy. Have you seen situations where it's like, oh my gosh, what is happening here? And like, how was that addressed? Like, I mean, I'm assuming that some of this like suggestion to have activities for kids maybe came from some of this data so that people with, children in groups would answer. But have you seen other examples like that?
I can't say that we have. And one of the reasons we actually wanted to bring this to the community of practice was to encourage more people to do their own decline log analysis, because it's not that it's time consuming to do, but if we tried to do it for every single institution, that would be very time consuming in addition to everything else. So we haven't double checked everyone's decline log data to do this type of analysis. I also know, and again, one of the reasons why we wanted to bring it to the community was as a subtle reminder that the data provided by the decline logs are very useful. Not everyone does it super consistently. So it's kind of a reminder that you should do it if you can. And that's the best way to verify that your own sample would be representative, assuming you're using the correct systematic random sampling data collection technique. But I would argue that if you're doing it consistently and you see a big difference there, then it's something to bring directly either to the community as part of like a messaging, hey, has anyone else checked this? Are you finding differences? Or directly to the COVES team so we can problem solve around, is there an issue with the data collection? Is there an issue with the survey itself or the data collection location? Or how can we fix this so there aren't any known biases in your data?
Theoretically, if you did see a big difference in your own data, I mean, I think the first place probably to look would be at like, our data collectors understanding well enough the sampling procedures. And I don't have quite as much experience like working directly with a data collector who's struggling with that like over an extended period of time. But that would be probably the first thing to think about, like, oh, is this person, are they hesitating to approach a group that has small children for fear that they will say no or something like that? Just to sort of, show them some of the data and encourage them that actually some of them will say yes. And even some of those suggestions about like, oh, maybe bring activities, bring stickers, are as much to kind of support the fear or the perception that those folks will say no, because it certainly happens. It definitely happens. And it's always very clear why it's happening when you see somebody with a crying kid or whatever, or a kid who's just a little bit wiggly. So it's a good suggestion kind of regardless of how often it's happening. But again, yeah, I think the first place would be to, remind or review kind of sampling with data collectors and maybe try to calm some of the fear about, if there's a no, what do we do? For something like the perceived gender, I mean, our best guess about like why that might be happening, um, might just be that like societal conditioning where like, maybe a lot of women might just be more conditioned to just say yes to stuff. It's not really something that's in our control. But at least in the Science Center data, it does seem like we have more women overall in Science Centers visiting, using those respondent data, which that's a good point too in the chat about the group age and gender versus just the respondent. Probably better to report on the group if you're talking about the museum as a whole. But all this is to say, some of these things might be within your control and some of them kind of might not be. So in the end, it might just be something to say, hey, we can't do anything about this ultimately, or we've done all we can do about this, but just know that this discrepancy might be existing, and let's keep thinking about some ways that we might be able to address it.
And just a final note on that, unless there are any more questions before I turn it back over to you, Alex. The reason that we started the decline log data collection practice was as a validation procedure of our sampling method. So it was used expressly for this reason. Like when we look at COVES data, do we have confidence that this represents who we randomly sampled? Or is it just like a convenient sample based on a random technique that represents the group's most willing, right? Are there known differences that we need to account for or be worried about when we report our COVES data? And because of that like validation procedure, it's also important to note that the reason it hasn't gone away is because it can change over time, right? You might have like perfect consistency for a 6-month period, and then another 6-month period where actually there is more of a bias between who was sampled and said no and who actually filled out the survey. So it's not a bad idea to just periodically check. And if you note a trend that doesn't go away, where there are differences in some of those characteristics, that's when we want to pay more attention to it. Okay, so with that said, Alex, so of course, if there are any more questions about this, please feel free to email us or start a larger community conversation on our new website, which has a member portal, including some kind of forum. I'm going to turn it over to Alex to give everyone a demo and some quick updates.
It's going to be a very brief demo because it's pretty pretty much just there. But I wanted to sort of put in a plug to everybody to, if you have not really explored this yet, our end goal is that we would have a pretty active member area with lots of discussions and everything. But the first step of that is making sure that everybody who wants to can actually like log in and have access and know what they're doing. So spend some time on the website, try to log into the member area. If you encounter any difficulty, let us know. Some of you may have had some difficulty because of the way the website was set up and thinking that people hadn't like paid their dues or something, and so it expired you. That shouldn't be happening anymore. It told me I hadn't paid my dues and I was expired, so I had to kind of set it straight. But just, quick plug about this. So of course you've all seen our new website, I'm sure. If you haven't, navigate to it over at any time. And the way you get to that member area is helpfully with something that says member area. And the member login, if you do that, you'll be prompted to, I think, create a password, or maybe you also got an email. I got an email on September 12th. Sarah can correct me if that's the only email you should have seen or if there were any sent out in waves, but might look something like this from the COVES team, kind of having some information about how to log in, setting your password. So look for that email or navigate to the member page. It's a pretty simple area for now. but you can do things like you can add a profile. You can look at these meetings. You can see when the webinars are scheduled if you'd like to. So decline log data, hey, that's today, awesome. And look at the previous meetings that we put in the system. We actually have a member directory. So if you're curious about getting in touch with someone from a fellow museum, you can do that. You can filter them by like different type of institution or size, as long as that person's, that characteristic is kind of in there and they've allowed us to use it. And then, of course, there is the member discussion area, which right now just has this lovely post from Sarah saying, welcome to our space. But in the future, we'd like it to be, more active. But don't, worry about that. We worry about that. We'll try to start seeding conversations on there. We'll share things. Maybe we'll ask some of you to share things. If we get a really interesting question in the email, we'll say, hey, why don't you just put it up on the member space, and we'll try to start a discussion there. Just trying to start moving people toward this. But of course, as I was saying, the first step is just to make sure that you can log in and that you understand what's going on, as Ryan and I have been doing the past recent weeks, realizing that there were little hiccups with our own membership logins. So don't let that happen to you, and we'll try not to let that happen to you as well. So Sarah, I don't know, if there's anything else you want to add to this, because you've been so active in getting this set up for us, please do.
Yeah, thanks for carrying this forward and stumbling into things that we've been learning on the fly, because as we shared, I don't know, 10 months ago, we are not website developers. We like spreadsheets and they like Qualtrics. So we've been sort of working with the team to move things over and create more interactive spaces. But you all, please feel free to reach out to me. I've been the one sort of moving all of the content over and thinking about some of the pieces of structure. And so if you're running into issues, I'm here for you. And you'll be able to post things, and then we will, as conversations start filling in that forum, we'll create different categories. So we can, if there are a lot of conversations about keeping data collectors trained, or new and different resources for data collectors, we'll create sort of like a subcategory for that. So we'll start filtering things, and you'll be able to find it. And this can be an ongoing resource of the community, built by the community together. So that's really what we're hoping to do. And I have received a few questions from folks as they logged in from the email went out sort of immediately after, or within like the day after our last community practice meeting. So if you're looking from that back in time, it would be back right around that time. So I followed up with a few people, but I can send out that post again in case it didn't make it to you. It'll go to folks who have not yet logged in. And then we can go from there if you're having more problems.
Thanks, Sarah, for all your very hard work on getting this up and running for us. We're really excited about the possibilities to come. So really hoping that it'll be a great space for everybody as we continue to develop it. So that's all the content we have for you today. Again, please follow up on any of the stuff with us. If you are looking to dig into your decline log data and you get confused, let us know. We can help. We're always there. And, if any other questions come up after we end this Zoom call, please don't hesitate to email coves@mos.org. We hope you found this really helpful. So if there's no other last minute questions, we'll send you all on your way on this lovely spooky Tuesday in spooky season. Bye, everyone. Good to see you all.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.